You are now listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. You know, I want to talk to you about power, the reality of power, because we need power in our own individual lives, the lives of our communities, our family, our nation, the world, and we need power in fighting any form or kind of spiritual battle, no matter what dimension that spiritual battle may occur in. So, for example, the military uses a term called full spectrum dominance, and the idea is that our military, the U.S. military, the goal is to be the most powerful, finest military in the world. So full spectrum dominance is when our military exercises dominion or dominance over the seas with a navy, over the air with jets and various planes, etc., drones, underwater with submarines dominating the sphere of underwater battlefields. And it continues on. The weather. The military boasted a number of years ago, and I did a piece in one of the Paul McGUIRE Report videos, and I opened it up further in one of my books, A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 1 and 2, where the military proclaimed, this is about, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the military proclaimed that in their effort to accomplish full spectrum dominance, that they literally would own the weather. So the U.S. military, their phrase was, we're going to own the weather. We're going to control or dominate the weather. And don't think for a moment that that's not true. If you are even semi-alert, semi-conscious, you can simply observe the contemporary weather patterns, and it should be obvious to you, as it's obvious to me. I've been around a while. Many of you have been around for a while. And those of you who have been around for a while know that the clouds, the way the clouds fill up the sky, the composition of the clouds, the activity of the clouds, the shape of the clouds, the frequency of the clouds. All of this is completely or radically different from what the clouds used to look like when I was a kid. I mean, I have vivid memories growing up in New York City, traveling to Missouri and other places as a young kid, looking up at the clouds. And, you know, when you're walking around on planet Earth, you do a lot of looking up on the clouds, at the clouds, and remembering their shape, their size, and their behavior. And many people who were alive in the generations that I have been alive in, you've observed the same thing. The weather, and this is really kind of bizarre to say, but the weather, the weather that we experience now is no longer the weather that we grew up with as children or young adults. The composition of the clouds, the frequency of rains, the lack of rains, and all the rest of that stuff, it's nowhere like what it was, 30 years ago. So what caused this radical change in weather? Now, I meet people today who tell me adamantly that there's no change in the weather whatsoever. The weather has always been the way it is now. That's a bunch of baloney, and you know it and I know it. And then I meet people who say to me, because I'll tell you a partial story, but anyway, people who don't believe that the weather has radically changed are people that don't want to deal with the implications psychologically of the fact that the weather has changed, because it's a fact, it's documented, the weather has changed significantly. So, there are huge numbers of people in the United States of America and around the world that they God gave each one of us a will. We have willpower. And we can choose, apart from the facts and documentation, God has given us the power to choose with our will what we want to believe or not. Or furthermore, what we want to admit to ourselves is true or not. So our human willpower regarding our human perception can control, if we allow it to, it can control our perceptions, our beliefs, and our ideas. So when I meet people in different age groups, those that were around to remember, like me and you, many of you, we were around to remember what the weather looked like back then. But then there are a whole bunch of generations, you know them and I know them, that they have only been able to observe the weather with their perception through a contemporary period of time. Now, I have been all over the United States speaking at conferences and all kinds of stuff. A lot of times I will take a jog walk or jog around a hotel or wherever the conference is. And I will inevitably look up at the skies, and I have noticed that I have been in places like Fargo, North Dakota, Connecticut, Arizona, and then, mega states and cities like California and New York and stuff. But wherever I go, I notice that there are things that I learned a long time ago. I learned this decades ago. What I learned was that there is a reality called chemtrails. Now, people try to disguise what a chemtrail is by giving it the fancy name geoengineering. And the point is that chemtrails are a reality. And anybody who has a modicum of perception ability with their senses, like visual senses or whatever, I can look up at the sky, which I often do when I go to my backyard, and where we are is kind of up on a mountain, and you can see down on a massive valley, and you can see upwards, and I can see jets traveling over me. I see essentially three kinds of jets now. There are drones and military jets and police helicopters, which are now being employed to safeguard our cities. And then there are what you would call commercial jets, because anywhere you live in Southern California, chances are you're going to be over or under a pathway of the passenger flight jets as they land in airports like LAX or Burbank Airport or some of the other airports, LAX being the biggest airport in the area. And you see the path of the jets according to their flight plans. And you observe the nature of commercial jets carrying passengers. They have a particular jet trail of the, it's not smoke, it's the chemical composition coming out basically out of the back of a jet as the jet is burning its fuel. And jet fuel coming out of the back of a jet looks completely different than a chemtrail coming out of a jet. Two entirely different things to observe from your perception. So for example, if you were to look at the body of a cat and then you look over in a different direction and you see the body of a dog, unless you're essentially an idiot, anybody who has visual ability and even the most degraded sense of perception can tell from the shape and form the difference between a cat and a dog. It's pretty hard to confuse them. So when you look up at the sky in Southern California or anywhere else in the United States of America, you see the difference between a chemtrail and passenger flight jet exhaust, because they're two different things, like the cat and dog illustration I just gave you. Chemtrails come out of a jet and they're very thin white lines, almost like pencil lines being drawn in the sky. They're thin. The white chemical composition of the chemtrails is tight and pencil-like, and often a single chemtrail from a single plane, it'll look like a checkers board. You'll see lines going this way horizontally, you'll see lines going vertically eventually, and they start out as what looks like pencil-thin lines in the sky. And then as the wind blows, the thin pencil-like lines of the chemtrail is dispersed by the wind, and you watch it for 15 or 30 minutes, and eventually those chemtrails will no longer have the pencil-thin shape to them. The chemtrails will be dispersed, and you will no longer see the pencil-thin lines. The lines will be blurred and dissipated in the atmosphere. So what you'll see is a generalized dispersal of the chemtrail, which causes the atmosphere to be, to a low degree, less clear, and there's kind of like a white, filmy, almost unnoticeable smoke-like substance blending into the blue sky. And then what happens after that stuff has hung out in the sky, the actual chemicals in the chemtrails will begin to fall down into the earth, into the plants, into the trees, into gardens, into crops, and into the lungs and filters of millions of homes and office buildings. So, unless you're like stupid and non-observant, you will notice the difference between chemtrails and what's considered your ordinary jet exhaust. And anybody with a half a brain doesn't confuse the two. So when people tell you there's no such thing as chemtrails and argue to your face that, well, there's no such thing as chemtrails, that's just jet exhaust. First of all, that's an insult to you, because they're assuming you're an idiot like they are, and you're not an idiot like they are. You're using your perception faculties, and you're able to cognitively analyze the blatant, obvious difference between chemtrails and jet exhausts. So, you know, I had to, like many of you, I had to endure the bombastic comments from idiots over decades in total denial of the reality of chemtrails. Even though in my books, like A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 1 and 2, Are You Ready? Let's see, power from on high, the greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world. And many of my other books, I talk in detail about chemtrails. In fact, in the greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world, I quote extensively from a speech that the former head of the CIA gave to the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, in which he openly admitted that there were chemtrails, but the way he did it was like sleight of hand style, and he simply rebranded the chemtrails. He simply called the chemtrails geoengineering. So he admitted what was obvious. He admitted that there's like chemicals being dispersed in our skies. So in a sense, he was admitting that they were chemtrails, but he got himself off the hook by saying that those things were really geoengineering, and it was all part, and of course what he was saying was a lie, which contains a little bit of truth mixed with a lot of lies. And then he said that what that was geoengineering by our government, and all the planes and all the chemical trails were simply geoengineering designed to combat climate change. Now, originally, when they started the program, they said that the chemtrails were geoengineering designed to protect the planet Earth from global warming, like Al Gore, the village idiot, warned us about. Well, both of them were lying. Scientists now emphatically state that there's no such thing as global warming, and in fact, the world is actually getting cooler and colder. That's fact, and that's a fact. So this was so embarrassing to the environmental movement and people like Al Gore and the globalists in the United Nations, because they were playing their con game all based on the con that we have to unite to fight global warming. But then they found themselves speaking to the American public with their pants down, because they had to admit that there was no such thing as global warming, and that in fact the world was actually getting cooler and colder. So, in a sleight of hand trickery PR move, they rebranded the term global warming to climate change. So climate change is a very devious propaganda maneuver, because if you call the chemtrails climate change, or the need for chemtrails due to climate change, you're covering your posteriors, you're covering your bases both ways. If it's found out by the scientists that the world is getting cooler, you're safe to call it climate change. But if the scientists may change their minds again and say the world is getting hotter, like global warming, again, you're safe if you don't use the term global warming, and you're safe if you simply call it climate change. So this former CIA director, who was admitting that they were engaged in a planetary geoengineering project, kept saying that they were doing this to protect our planet and to protect humanity from the ravages of climate change. This way, he and all the other secret agents, if you will, secret agents of the deep state, would be safe no matter what truth emerged. And they could continue to put forward their con on the American people. Now, of course, it's easy to put forth a con on the American people when you have the mainstream media all controlled, all pumping out propaganda, all backing your lies up. Notice that the idiots, and they are really, the local mainstream media are so off the charts in their idiocy, I can't watch them for more than 30 seconds. I have never seen the emperor wears no clothes so prominently displayed by this lethargic group of idiots as local network television, which is the worst. And then next to that, it would be national network television. And then all the government-funded globalist propaganda organizations like the educational system, like science, like the major scientific publications, like the financial grants given to scientists, like money for experimentation. And all of these institutions, the medical associations, the food industry, the weather modification industry, the psychiatric, psychological industries, they're all united, and they all compare notes, and they all put out this pre-agreed upon propaganda, which has so far tragically, yeah, it's really a tragedy, it has so far tragically brainwashed hundreds of millions of Americans over the last 7 decades at least. And it has effectively embedded what Aldous Huxley called scientific mind control or propaganda. It has shaped the thinking and the perceptions and the belief systems of millions of people who have been indoctrinated since early childhood. Millions of Americans have been indoctrinated where they can no longer think for themselves. They no longer have functioning analytical ability or cognitive ability. They can only regurgitate back like a parrot or regurgitate back like a programmed AI robot whatever it is that has been programmed into them to think, believe, and say. So when you go back to the original roots of all this, it goes way back, but the original roots of this began to take off with a fury during pivotal periods in American history and global history. And I'll give you an example. 2 of the most powerful, influential insiders that have ever lived in the human race were Aldous Huxley and Julian Huxley, who I refer to constantly, and it's perfectly okay because the amount of influence they had on the world is astronomical. And Aldous Huxley was the author of Brave New World, which called for a scientific dictatorship. His brother Julian Huxley was the father of transhumanism, and he created the UNESCO, United Nations Global Educational Plan known as Common Core, and your kids most likely have been taught under the Common Core system. And what you have to know about the Huxley's Common Core educational system is that Common Core is rotten to the core. It's a corrupt educational system designed to indoctrinate, program, and brainwash millions of students who are all spoon-fed the same common globalist, humanist, United Nations type curriculum. And that's basically why I think America, I believe I'm correct in this, America spends the most money on public education, and yet simultaneously, even though America spends the most money on education, America is at the very bottom of nations in terms of how effectively their children and America's students are educated. So what the accurate statistics tell us is that American education has the lowest standard of education in the world, and American education produces the least educated kids and students in the entire world. I mean, you want to know why your kids can't compete in a global marketplace? Look at just some of the television interviews and alternative videos and television programs. And when they interview the kids in college and high school, you're stunned at their stupidity and their lack of knowledge and their ability to think. It's not funny, although it's designed to be funny. If you think about it, it's shocking and it's horrific. The kids are like zombies, and they were educated to be zombies. And the logistical, statistical assessments from prominent educators that have integrity and knowledge, year after year, they come up with the same statistical results, which is simply that American schools are at the very bottom in terms of worldwide educational standards, and American students are the least educated students of any nation on planet Earth. And yet, the same statistics tell us, despite the fact that American students and American schools and American education receives more money, more finances than any other educational system in the world, than any other educational system in any other nation. So here's the disparity, which is, well, once you realize it's intentional, it all makes sense. Somebody, this is where you have to have your own brain that works. Somebody somewhere obviously wants to dumb down American students. And what do you think the purpose might be for intentionally dumbing down American students and making them stupid? What would be the hidden agenda in that? Ask yourself that question. Who would benefit by creating an educational system in America which dumbs down the students, which produces students who have the worst education of any nation on planet Earth, and whose schools do the worst job of educating their students of any other nation on planet Earth, despite the fact that American education and educators receive more money lavishly than any other educational system on Earth. So you have to ask yourself the obvious question: how could this be? I mean, they've been talking about this problem since I've been a little kid. They've been talking about it since you've been a little kid. So obviously this outcome, people like Bill Gates and all the other snotty globalists that are full of themselves, Bill Gates and his trendy globalist trillionaire pals who jet around the world and violate everything they want to force you and I to abide by. They love to, these guys who run these billion-dollar tech companies and other kinds of companies, they love to flaunt their executive, high-tech managerial knowledge. And so Bill Gates and others are always dropping buzz phrases and buzzwords like outcomes. Well, outcome is simply what your plans, what your money, what your strategy, what your business is designed to produce at the end of the day. Or outcome is just a fancy term for what kind of results or profits do you expect to produce or make by abiding by these plans that you love so much. What is the outcome? Or they like the term outcomes. What are the outcomes? Well, if you're spending more money on the educational system, schools, and students than in any other nation on planet Earth, since your investment is so massive, one would think that you have an expectation of certain outcomes, right? Or you wouldn't be spending and investing trillions of dollars in the American educational system. I mean, Bill Gates himself spent a fortune in promoting Common Core. He spent a fortune distributing free Microsoft computers in school systems all across America. Bill Gates, I think he was one of the key funders and shakers and movers of the No Child Left Behind program and the Common Core program. Okay, so Bill Gates, whatever you may think of him, is a very bright guy. He's probably, well, I'm sure he's a genius. And he has at his disposal experts in every field. And so when he tosses around the term like, outcomes, you better believe it that Bill Gates and the educational establishment and scientists and the think tanks and the globalists, you better believe that these guys and girls have a very red-hot burning expectation of precisely and exactly what outcomes they are expecting from their massive, massive investments in education, in computers for students, in educational programs, etc., and educational programs like Common Core.